The families of those who fell in the Great War were told that a space had been reserved for a personal inscription on the headstones that would stand in the soldiers' cemeteries, whether on the Western Front or on other battlefields. What can we make of these inscriptions more than a century later? On my first visit to the battlefields in Flanders in the summer of 1982 with my school, my old history teacher, the late Roger Bastable, told us how that after the Great War, the families of the fallen paid for an inscription on the headstones. And he inspired us as we walked those cemeteries of Flanders fields to look for inscriptions and to see what they told us about how families felt about the sacrifice of their loved ones in the Great War. And that fascination with these inscriptions and the search for them continues for me to this very day. When you visit the battlefields of the Great War and you walk round the silent cities, the cemeteries, whether it's on the Somme or in Flanders or on other battlefields much further afield, you're drawn to what is on there, not just the details of the man himself and the regiment and the date of death, but that personal inscription that the families added after the war. And what you find over the years, even if you've been to a cemetery on many, many occasions, is that the planting of the shrubs and the flowers changes, and sometimes they'd been obscuring an inscription that had been there and you hadn't seen it before. So it's, for me, an evolving part of the experience of visiting these battlefields of the Great War, wandering along the rows of the graves and reading the thoughts of those families from a century ago. And it is a century now since those families began to add those inscriptions to the headstones in the cemeteries of the First World War. But how did this come about, and how did it get to a point where families could add this inscription? With the fighting now over, and this is something that we've discussed in some previous podcasts, right across the battlefields where the conflict had taken place, there were hundreds and hundreds of military cemeteries, some of them small burial grounds, some of them much bigger, and on top of that, many isolated graves. So when the war ended, the Imperial War Graves Commission that had been founded in 1917, who took on the responsibility for the permanent care and remembrance of the men who were buried on the battlefields of the Great War, when they began to look at the situation, it was quickly realised that all of these cemeteries could not be made permanent. So this massive task began to search for, recover and rebury the dead, whether that was bodies buried in isolation, in shell holes or in old trenches or in positions that were then recovered, or whether it was small burial grounds that could not be maintained indefinitely. There was a huge movement of the dead in the early 1920s as new cemeteries were created, concentration cemeteries, where the dead from the surrounding battlefields were brought in to be properly commemorated in that place. So, for example, if we look just at Ypres in Flanders, there was something like 550 British and Commonwealth cemeteries around the city by the end of the conflict. These were then concentrated into 174 permanent cemeteries, and that reduction in the size and scope of the cemeteries that existed at that stage was pretty much typical of other battlefields of the First World War. But of course, the British Army had not just fought on the Western Front. This was a world war, and it fought in many corners of the globe. On battlefields like northern Italy, up in the hills and the mountains, cemeteries had been created there and had to be made permanent. On the land of former enemies, so at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles in Turkey, a country that post-war was eventually occupied by the British, cemeteries were created there from original wartime cemeteries that had to have been abandoned following the withdrawal from Gallipoli in January of 1916. So the task was a global one. It was a vast, and excuse the pun, a monumental task to bring the dead in to places where they could be properly commemorated and then make those sites permanent. But what to replace the individual grave markers with? If you look at photographs of a typical cemetery on the Western Front, you'll see that there are so many different types of grave markers that were used. There were the standard wooden crosses, that the graves registration units used to mark individual graves, but very often men from the units where soldiers had been killed made crosses for their comrades, for their mates, and these could take all sorts of shapes and forms. Painted Celtic crosses with regimental badges and detailed inscriptions, for example, were not uncommon when we look at the photographs from late 1918 on into 1919 and 20. So there was a great diversity, and in some cases they'd not just use wood to commemorate a soldier by marking his grave, they'd use stone. So on the Somme, for example, quite a few Australian units had got a local French stonemason who was living in a village behind the front to come and construct for them markers that would go on individual graves. And there are some examples of these that survive in the cemeteries today. Highly Station Cemetery on the Somme is one such example. But what to do with all these different types of grave markers? The wooden ones wouldn't last forever. The stone ones might last longer, perhaps for decades, but none of them would be there indefinitely. And what would be the cost of all these, the cost of maintaining them, and who would bear that cost? Would it be the government or would it be the families? And then the fear grew that if it was left to the families, then the son of an aristocratic family would have a huge monument on his grave, but the grave of poor Private Smith, who came from the back streets of Manchester, his wife or his parents would not have enough money to even maintain a wooden cross. So the decision was made that the government would take on the responsibility and they would pay for this. But that meant the removal of the original grave markers and the replacement of those with what was initially decided as headstones. Now, this led to a bit of a debate in Parliament because there were many people who didn't like the idea of headstones. It said that Kipling was one of those behind the headstone idea because, having travelled widely within the British Empire, he knew that not every man was necessarily a Christian, and he felt that the whole purpose of the replacement of crosses and grave markers with a permanent marker was to commemorate the men of that generation who'd fallen, and that a tablet or a headstone was the best way of doing that. But there were dissenting voices in Parliament when you read the records and the newspapers of that 1919 period when this was being debated. Petitions had been signed, but with huge backing by members of Parliament, members of the House of Commons and a wider public to try and push the headstone idea into the corner. And when it came to replacing grave markers, they would be replaced with stone crosses. But there were all sorts of practical and financial reasons behind not doing that. And Winston Churchill stood up in Parliament and he gave this response to those who were requesting this. Mr. Churchill, in reply, suggested that they should nominate from those present 3 representatives, one each from the House of Lords, the House of Commons and the trade unions, to go into the details with the Commission. He was certain that they would be greatly surprised at the enormous difficulties, the physical and practical difficulties attendant upon a cruciform headstone. Once they proceeded on the basis of equality of treatment, which he understood was unanimously accepted, and once it was recognised that there was no refusal of religious symbols, but that, on the contrary, they contemplated that every headstone should bear its religious symbol, the question which remained for discussion was really limited to the practical difficulties as between the cruciform shape and the headstone shape. So that was Churchill's reply, and that's what became government policy thereafter, that the practical difficulties in trying to replace wooden crosses with stone ones on nearly 500,000 graves was just too great, and that the headstone was the better way forward. And again, Kipling, who was one of these great voices within the Imperial War Graves Commission at this time, his view was that on this memorial tablet, on this headstone, you could add personal details, and one of those he felt should be a personal inscription. So while many families had wanted to repatriate the dead and bring them home, or if they remained, place some great monument on the grave, that wasn't possible in the conditions that existed on these battlefields after the war, and it wasn't really fair as well to the families of missing soldiers where that would never be an option. The way to personalise them, the way for the families to be involved in the commemoration was to give them that option to add a personal inscription. But how to organise these and how to make it possible and collect the details. And that's what led to the posting out in that period from 1919 on into the early 1920s to the families of those soldiers who had marked graves what was called a final verification form. So what was one of those? Well, this was a paper form that the Imperial War Graves Commission sent out to the next of kin. The address that they used was the last noted address in the soldier's service record, and of course this meant that some went to addresses that were no longer current and replies were not received, but a large number hit their target, got to where they were meant to be and reached those families. And it was a folded paper form where on one side the basic military details about the soldier was listed, and this was the minimum details required to be inscribed on the headstone. Below that were the details of how this would all work, and I'll read those for you from a final verification form now. The headstone will have engraved on it the naval or military inscription, the badge of the deceased's naval or military unit, and an emblem of his religious faith. The Commission would be obliged if you would kindly assist them by saying whether the above particulars, name, initials, honours, etc., are correct, in order that the naval or military inscription may be absolutely accurate. A space A is provided on the opposite page for any corrections you may desire to make. If you wish the age to be engraved, you will give particulars in the space on the opposite page after the word age. In addition, a space has been reserved at the foot of the headstone below the emblem of religious faith to allow for the engraving at your expense of a short personal inscription or text of your own choice. It is regretted that special alphabets such as Greek cannot be accepted. The length of the inscription is limited by the space available on the headstone and should, in consequence, not exceed 66 letters, the space between two words counting as one letter. For instance, if you choose 12 words, the total number of actual letters should not exceed 55, there being 11 spaces between these words. If you desire to use the space, will you kindly write clearly the inscription or text you select in the space B opposite. A claim from the amount due from you in respect of the engraving of the selected inscription will be sent to you in due course. The present price is 3.5 pence per letter, but this may be subject to future fluctuations of cost. Unless you express a wish to the contrary, in the space C opposite, a cross will be engraved in the centre of the stone. Yours faithfully, Fabian Ware, Major General, Vice Chairman, Imperial War Graves Commission. So having been provided with the information as to what they would be required to do now, the families could then amend the details that were on there. If anything was wrong, they could change it, they could add the age. Now that's an interesting part of it as well, is because the ages were never verified. So the Imperial War Graves Commission, when they got the details of a soldier's age back, that was never checked in any kind of records. And we know from quite a few examples that very often the family got the age wrong, or it was written in such a way that the person who read the form misread it and then engraved the wrong age on the headstone. And that was done in both directions. So we know of soldiers who were believed to be very young, where in fact the age was wrong and they were older. And there are examples of soldiers believed to have been amongst some of the older ones to have died, but when research was done into them, it was found that actually they were younger and that older age on the headstone was incorrect. So when we look at the details of men within the cemetery registers and on the headstones when it comes to age, we have to treat that information with some degree of care. And I remember we recently had an episode about soldiers who were executed in the First World War. The two Julians, Julian Sykes and Julian Potowski, when they researched their book Shot at Dawn on the men who were executed back in the 1980s, found that several of the men who were shot, the age on their headstone was out by as much as 10 years. So I think it all gives us an insight into how complex this task was for the Imperial War Graves Commission in the immediate post-war world. But the key phrase there, which concerns us in this episode, looking at personal inscriptions, is that phrase, a space has been reserved. And it's that space where the families could personalise this headstone to make it theirs, to put their input into how they felt about the loss and how they felt about the soldier who was buried in that grave. And the interesting thing about these forms is that one of the other things you had to state on it was your relationship to the casualty. Now, most of them were filled in by the parents or the wife, but in some cases the soldier's parents had died or they weren't married, and it was sisters or brothers who put this in. And the surviving forms, which have now been digitised by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and put onto their website, gives you an interesting indication as to how many other family members were involved in this. So the forms went out. There was about 500,000 headstones that were planned to be put in place on different battlefields of the Great War. And in the end, something like 229,000 inscriptions were chosen by family members. So that's not quite half. What were the reasons why somebody wouldn't reply, wouldn't add an inscription? Well, I'm sure that the cost was an element in this. 3.5 pence doesn't sound like a lot, but in the early 1920s, if this was your breadwinner in the grave, it might be an issue when it came to paying for it. The Australian and Canadian governments decided to pay on behalf of their families, so if anybody couldn't afford it, they would step in and pay for them. The New Zealand government decided that this whole question of charging for inscriptions was unfair, so they banned personal inscriptions for all New Zealand soldiers' families. Now, a couple of them got through the net, and one particular cemetery, Dulon Cemetery, there are 2 graves of New Zealanders there that have personal inscriptions on, and I think whoever was responsible for the placement of inscriptions of graves within that cemetery perhaps wasn't aware that the New Zealand government had banned them. So Kipling's idea for this space to be used by the families to personalise them was a good one, but it had gone slightly awry when the government had insisted that the commission should charge those families for this inscription. So unlike the cemeteries where the principle was uniformity in death, everyone was equal, the inscriptions, it really wasn't the same, because your ability to place an inscription on there was based on your means, your ability to pay. So when we look at the graves of officers, they have a much higher proportion of personal inscriptions because the families of those type of men had money to be able to afford it. Regular soldiers who joined before the war, that came from the lower end of British society with little money, their families had little money, so often you see nothing on their graves at all. So it created this great disparity really between the families of the fallen, and that complete uniformity in death didn't come around until the Second World War, when after that conflict the Imperial War Graves Commission did not charge for the placement of inscriptions on headstones. So if you travel to a cemetery in Normandy or Arnhem, or from the Italian campaign, or at Alamein, or in the Far East, you will find far more personal inscriptions on the headstones there compared to cemeteries of the Great War, because there was no question of charging. So of the 229,000 inscriptions that came in, were they all automatically then added to the headstone? Was it just a case of what we'd now describe as cut and paste? Well, no, because actually all of the inscriptions were then vetted by the Imperial War Graves Commission. So why did they do this? Why did they vet them? Well, there was a fear that inappropriate statements, was the phrase used, would somehow be submitted and therefore engraved on the headstones. And indeed it proved that 1 or 2 potential inscriptions that were submitted were considered inappropriate by the authorities. An Australian mother, for example, wanted "murdered by the German nation" engraved on her son's headstone, and there were examples of that phrase "murdered" being used by British families as well, and that was considered inappropriate, so those inscriptions were refused. But when we look at the types and the range of inscriptions that there are, they were pretty accepting. I mean, we again spoke about soldiers executed in the Great War. "Shot at dawn" was accepted, and that was engraved on the headstone of Albert Ingham in that cemetery on the Somme after he'd been executed in 1916. So most were accepted, most were placed in that space that had been reserved. So let's have some examples that gives us a bit of an indication into the type of grief and how people dealt with the loss of family members and loved ones in the Great War by looking at some of the inscriptions. I wanted to start this look at inscriptions, and with 229,000, obviously we can't possibly cover them all, or even a fraction of them really, because it's too vast. But I wanted to give you a bit of an insight into the sort of things that you can read, which I hope will inspire you then to look out for such inscriptions and find your own fascinating ones, which tweet me, put on the blog, talk to us at one of the social evenings about. That'd be really great. But I wanted to start this away from the Western Front at Gallipoli. There's 31 cemeteries on the Gallipoli Peninsula from the operations there in 1915. It's a very different landscape to the Western Front, and some of those cemeteries are very, very isolated. The farm, for example, takes quite a trek to it, as does 4th Battalion Parade Ground. But it's a rewarding thing to do because they sit there in this incredible landscape with some truly stunning views across Suvla Bay or Anzac or down at Cape Helles. And it really is a very different sort of experience in some respects that you would get by visiting the Somme or Ypres. But the other interesting bit about Gallipoli is that when you go to the cemeteries, there are no headstones of unknown soldiers. A decision was made there not to mark the graves of unknowns with headstones as we see in the cemeteries of the Western Front. So you won't wander along a row and see an unknown soldier of the Great War known unto God. This was done because of the physical difficulties of getting headstones to the peninsula. The number of unknowns there were in each cemetery was often the majority actually of burials. So a decision, because of the logistics, was made to only mark the graves of known casualties. So that means that when you walk through the cemeteries at Gallipoli, every headstone you look at is an identified soldier, and very many of them have inscriptions on. Now, it's an interesting thought. Are there more inscriptions at Gallipoli? Because that was further away and the chances of the family ever going there were pretty remote. Who knows? It's interesting speculation. And at this point as well, when we begin to look at some of these Gallipoli inscriptions, I want to mention John Laffin's book on impersonal inscriptions that he published in the 1990s. I think one of his best books. Is quite a controversial historian, John Laffin, and I would be the first to say that I never agreed with most of what he said, particularly about the conduct of the war in high command, but he did a lot to inspire people's interest in the Great War. I was lucky to have met him on several occasions. He came to the house at Courcelette and had tea quite a few times, and he was always very good at sharing knowledge and pointing you in the direction of places to go and visit. So fair plays to John Laffin. He put out a lot of information there, prolific writer, and wrote some incredible number of books, something like 100, 150 books on different aspects of both military and history generally. But his book on inscriptions, which I'll put a link to on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, was, I think, the first one ever published that looks specifically of what the inscriptions might tell us and give some examples of them. And that's been followed by a number of other books, which I'll also put on the podcast website for you to have a look at. So when we look at the Australian ones that he highlighted in that book, we've got the grave of Trooper W.A. Baker, for example, of the 9th Australian Light Horse, who died on the 28th of November 1915 and is buried at Embarkation Pier Cemetery. And his rather curious inscription reads, "Brother Bill a sniping fell. We miss him still, we ever will." Sergeant R. Newton of the 14th Battalion Australian Imperial Force, which was Jacka's Mob, or became Jacka's Mob, after Jacka won his Victoria Cross with that battalion at Gallipoli in 1915. He fell on the 27th of April 1915, so a few days after the landing, and he's buried at Beach Cemetery. And his inscription gives us an early indication into identity, soldiers' identity, what they were a part of, because his inscription is "Our Anzac." And an Anzac was a soldier who was part of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and it became eventually, and is still today, a byword for Australian soldiers in the Great War. So that inscription, placed in the 20s, just shows how early that was part of the identity of the Australian soldiering generation of the First World War. But although they identified themselves as Anzacs, many still identified themselves with the Old World. Private R.O. Harwood of the 3rd Battalion AIF, who was killed on the 30th of November 1915 and is buried at Shell Green Cemetery, On his grave it reads, "He died for England." Now, the percentage of Australians who were born in Britain before the Great War and had emigrated to Australia was lower compared to Canada, for example, where it was something like 70%. But nevertheless, there were a lot of men serving in that 1st Australian Division that fought here at Gallipoli who had come to Australia before the war from Great Britain, and indeed from many other nations beside. The grave of Private G.R. Prideaux, also of the 3rd Battalion AIF, who died on the 13th of May 1915, and he's buried in that isolated cemetery, 4th Battalion Parade Ground, reads, "Gallipoli, thou holdest him ever, his memory thou canst never sever." And that idea that Gallipoli holds him forever is something that was reflected in a lot of soldier writing of that time, and indeed some of the early war poetry of Australians that fought in the Great War. The idea of these great battalions sleeping by the shore who would guard the beaches and the gullies and the ravines for all time. So it kind of reflects that. Trooper Harry Rush of the 10th Light Horse, who was killed on the 7th of August 1915 and is buried at Walker's Ridge, his inscription reads, "His last words, 'Goodbye, Cobber, God bless you.'" And that phrase, "Goodbye, Cobber," was such a powerful one, I think, to that generation that marched to war from Australia in 1914. The importance of your cobber, of your mate, and indeed mateship within the Australian Imperial Force was a really, really important one, and something I still think resonates a century later. Now, those are just a few examples of some Australian ones, and I would recommend that Laughing book to sit down and have a good read of it. But of course, Australia was just part of the forces that were at Gallipoli in 1915, and a few of the British inscriptions that I've noted over the years. When I first went to Gallipoli about 20 odd years ago, I visited all 31 cemeteries in that very first trip. It was really important, I think, to do that. And you do get drawn to the headstones and the inscriptions that are on them. So I made a lot of notes of ones that I saw. And in 12 Tree Copse Cemetery is the grave of 2nd Lieutenant A.V. Smith, VC, of the East Lancs Regiment. He got a posthumous Victoria Cross at Gallipoli. And on his headstone is a real favourite inscription of mine that I've seen a few times, not a lot of times, but a few times in different locations. "Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me." And that's part of the first stanza of Alfred Lord Tennyson's Crossing the Bar. "Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me, and may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea." So here, overlooking the Aegean Sea on the shores of Gallipoli, perhaps that felt particularly relevant. A really unusual inscription is found on the grave of Lieutenant L.P. Jones of the 2nd Battalion, the Hampshire Regiment, who died on the 6th of June 1915 and is buried at Redoubt Cemetery near Crithea. His inscription reads, "England is a garden, ill weeds grow apace, keep our garden weeded." And at the end of it, it says LPJ, which is his initials, so one must presume that that phrase was written by him. England is a garden, ill weeds grow apace, keep our garden weeded. What did he really mean by that? Did he mean that there were too many people in England, or not the right sort of people, and that the war would somehow cut away the chaff, leaving only the best? The reality of conflict is the bullets know no bounds. The best die alongside everyone else, including, here at Gallipoli, Jones himself. And then this one on the grave of Sapper P.R. Bryce of the Deal Royal Marines Royal Naval Division Engineers, who died on the 25th of July 1915, is buried in Skew Bridge Cemetery. It reads, "This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song." Was this some attempt by his family to try and make sense of the terrible campaign that Gallipoli was, a failure, a defeat? And how difficult was it for families like those to make sense of the outcome of battles and campaigns like Gallipoli? But jumping from the Dardanelles to the Western Front, let's look at some inscriptions that give us an insight into different aspects of how people coped with grief, confronted grief and loss, and how they made sense of everything that had happened between those years of 1914 and 18. So first of all, if we look at some inscriptions that really pull at our heartstrings, Private G.T. Palmer of the Leicestershire Regiment, who died on the 24th of February 1917 and is buried in Fonquevilliers Military Cemetery on the Somme, on his headstone, which I know is visited by many people who travel to the Somme battlefields, it reads, "Will some kind hand in a foreign land place a flower on my son's grave?" Now, many people believe that to be unique, but actually there's quite a few examples of that inscription being used or variations upon it. But it's a very powerful statement, the mother perhaps thinking that she will never get to visit her son's grave, or even if she does, perhaps the once, it's never enough, and she hopes that someone passing by will do her the courtesy of marking the grave when they do so. So that kind of thought that must have been on the minds of so many mothers who lost sons in the Great War, it really draws at your heartstrings. A variation on that is on the grave of Private P.J. Hudson of the Newfoundland Regiment, who died of wounds probably received at Beaumont Hamel on the 4th of July 1916 and is buried at Guézancourt Cemetery. "Kind friends of France, keep green for me my soldier's grave, mother." Newfoundland was a long way from the Somme, another world away in many respects. How did she feel about her son's grave standing there on that hillside in an isolated communal cemetery? What would it look like? Who would keep it green? And over a century later, that incredible work that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission continues to do in places like these, it's them. They're the ones that keep that grass green for the mother of Private Hudson. And some of these inscriptions that really pull upon our heartstrings also hint at the guilt associated with grief. Private W. Vickers of the York and Lancaster Regiment, who died on the 31st of July 1918 and is buried at Turlington Cemetery on the French coast, his inscription, placed by his parents, reads, "The midnight star shines over the grave of one we loved but could not save." What tortured thoughts did they have about their son? Did they feel they could have done more? If only they'd been there when he was brought into the hospital where he died, could they have done more to save him? So far away from their home, and as I've said a few times on this podcast, I always think that the families, in particular the mothers and the sisters and the wives of these men who'd fallen, they were as much victims of the Great War as the men whose loss they felt, because they were drawn into it forever, for the rest of their lives. It lived with them day in, day out. And these little sentences on the headstones across the battlefields give us an insight into this. There are also inscriptions that I would describe as unusual and intriguing. At Zillebeek Churchyards is the grave of Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Chesney Wilson, commanding officer of the Royal Horse Guards, who died on the 6th of November 1914. On his headstone it reads, "Life is a city of crooked streets, death the marketplace where all men meet." And I've stood at that grave many times and read that. In fact, that very first trip that I mentioned right at the beginning of this podcast, that was one of the inscriptions that Roger Bastable pointed out to us when we went there as students. And as I've got older, perhaps I can see more of the pathos in that statement, more of its meaning. But whatever, it's an amazing one. And when it comes to unusual, although the final verification form said that certain types of lettering could not be inscribed on the headstones, there are lots of exceptions to this, and there are some where it's not even letters, there are symbols on there. So the grave of Major R.T. Carter MC of the Royal Garrison Artillery, who died on the 18th of August 1918 in the latter stages of the breakout at Amiens and is buried at Heath Cemetery at Harbonnières, it says "Rest in Peace" in Latin on there, but then beneath it is a fleur-de-lis type crest engraved right across the entire base of the headstone. Now, was this some kind of family crest? And how was that done? The stonemasons were brought in from Britain to do the inscriptions on the graves and to carve the badges and the military details. They used predominantly British stonemasons because of the language. it was felt that if they used French or Belgian engravers, then they might misspell things. But to have some kind of engraving like this really is quite unusual. And one of the only other examples I know of it is at Polkapel Cemetery in Belgium. And that's the grave of 2nd Lieutenant H.G. Langton of the 2nd 4th London Regiment, who died in the 3rd Battle of Ypres on the 26th of October 1917. Now, his inscription is a piece of music. This is totally unique, something that the Commission highlighted on the centenary of his death in 2017. He was a promising violinist, perhaps composer, and there is quite a lot of debate over the origin of the music. Some thought it was from a particular piece of music, others now have their doubts. And there's a really good video looking at what this music meant and what it was all about and what it sounds like that the Commission put out, which I've embedded onto the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, where you can go on there and listen to it. So there are intriguing and unusual ones, but what about headstones that actually question the war, question the sacrifice, question the service? Well, they're a lot rarer. They do exist. Many people are quite surprised by this, given that the inscriptions were vetted. And some years ago, I was asked to write a chapter for a book called Passchendaele in Perspective by Professor Peter Liddell, which looked at different aspects of the 3rd Battle of Ypres. And I wrote a chapter looking at pilgrimage and commemoration. And I did a study in Tynecott Cemetery where I contrasted the sentiments that were on the headstones written by the parents of the soldiers, largely, of course, Victorians, people who'd grown up in the Victorian world and all that meant, where the references, or at least the common ones, were about the righteousness of sacrifice with reference to God, king and country and empire. And with one exception in there, which we'll come to shortly, there was nothing that questioned the war. Whereas if you then contrasted that to the modern cemetery visitors' books, where if you look through those, the most common phrase used was why. Now, interestingly, there was one headstone engraved with that phrase. Private P.S. Ems of the 1st 4th Norfolk Regiment, who died on the 18th of August 1915 and is buried in East Mudros Military Cemetery, which was a reception area for casualties coming back from Gallipoli, where men died of their wounds and they were buried in this cemetery. On his headstone it says why. So that's the only example, but there are others that hint at this as well. And in Tynecott Cemetery, as I mentioned, is the grave of 2nd Lieutenant Young. 2nd Lieutenant Arthur Conway Young of the Royal Irish Fusiliers died on the 16th of August 1917 in the crossing of the Steambeak River. On his headstone it's inscribed, born at Kobe, Japan, 9th of October 1890, sacrifice to the fallacy that war can end war. And that's a very powerful one. And it hints, of course, at a lot of what many people felt in that interwar period, as the promises of homes fit for heroes and that sacrifice would be remembered and honoured. Instead, there was a massive financial crash and terrible, awful poverty suffered not just by the returning veterans, but the families of those who had fallen. So inscriptions like this give us an insight into that idea that before the Great War there'd been perhaps little criticism of conflict and war, the necessity of war, whereas now, given the outcome of this war and the sacrifice of so many for what, then statements like this, even if not written in stone, were perhaps on the mind of many people in that interwar period. And another example of that is at Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery on the Somme, the grave of Sergeant P.J. Ball, MM, of the 44th Australian Infantry, who died on the 28th of March 1918. His inscription reads, I fought and died in the Great War to end all wars. Have I died in vain? Now one wonders when that inscription went on there, as the 20s moved into the 30s with the rise of Nazi Germany and the threat of war once more. How did that generation that had survived the war, how did the parents of those who'd fallen look back on what had happened in the Great War and the million war dead? How did it affect their view of whether that sacrifice was worth it or not? And again, inscriptions like this give us an insight into that. A more common general one that you see along the same lines is "someday we'll understand." Now that could be a reference to a lot of different things. It could have a religious overtone to it. But I think that it was part of a general questioning of things that really had not existed before the war. Skepticism with the powers that be, challenging authority, not accepting everything that you were told. Does that emerge from the Great War? I'm sure there's a study in that in its own right. And then returning to that issue of cost that we mentioned, the 3.5 pence per letter that families had to pay even for the spaces, how did the pricing aspect affect what people put on the headstones? Did it make them come up with shorter ones so they could afford it? And what's the symbolism of a single word inscription? The cost aspect was certainly an important one. Over the years of taking people on visits to war graves on ledger battlefield tours, you get some great stories as to how inscriptions and how commemoration came about. And I've had quite a few examples of this where people have said that a whole group of family members had to pool their resources to be able to afford a very simple inscription on a grave. So when we look at this costing aspect, it really is important to consider. And I know many people believe that the Commission never chased up payments or perhaps never sent invoices out, but the records for that appear to have been lost, so probably we'll never truly know. But when we see these single word inscriptions, I think that also gives us an insight into something, and it shows just how powerful a single word can be. So for example, there are 3 headstones where it says missed. We miss you. We miss you forevermore. We miss you every day. Anyone who has lost someone under any circumstances knows how strong that feeling of missing them is. Another single word used on 14 headstones of the Great War is loved. He was loved. You were loved. We will never stop loving you. And on another 15 headstones, it just says love. Love will conquer all. Love will connect us to you evermore. Love will never separate us despite the distance, despite the fact that you've passed out of the sight of men. And then this one, which is used on 2 headstones of the Great War, missed, loved, they're all powerful. This one somehow gets me a little bit more. And it's laddie, our lad, our boy. You stand there, one of them, the grave of Sergeant Toms of the North Somerset Yeomanry, who's buried at Wimmera Communal Cemetery, and you read that simple word, laddie, and you think, who were you to them? Who wrote that? And when they wrote it, when they thought it, when they said it out loud, what picture came into their mind of you? These words, so simple but yet so powerful, still have a power even after that century since they were engraved on these stones. Now, like I say, with 229,000 inscriptions, we could go on forevermore almost talking about the different ways in which people expressed their grief, expressed their attachment to the man who was in that grave. And many of you listening to this will have looked for these inscriptions yourselves and will have your own favourite. So, what's mine? Well, for those of you who followed me on Twitter for many years, this probably won't be much of a surprise, but there's a grave at Guillemont Road Cemetery on the Somme of Lieutenant William Alexander Stanhope Forbes of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, who died on the 3rd of September 1916. His father was a landscape painter, member of the Royal Academy, and his father pinned this inscription, which I've searched for time and time again to see, did he lift it from a text, from a poem, from somewhere? But no, he seems to have written this himself. And for me, it sums up so much of what the Great War is about, what the men who fought in the Great War were about. And this is the inscription. He saw beyond the filth of battle and thought death a fair price to pay to belong to the company of these fellows. So wandering these silent cities, whether it's on the Western Front or at Gallipoli or on other battlefields of the Great War, you realise the inscriptions somehow call to you, that those men, women, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers and wives who penned these inscriptions, who wrote them on the forms, they're calling to you as well. And it makes you reflect, I think, on really just how unquiet these cemeteries of the Great War are, how unquiet that whole landscape is along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.